everyone. I'm Alexa Koenig, Executive Director of the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley School of Law. On behalf of Berkeley Haas's Dean, Ann Harrison, and the Human Rights and Business Initiative, a partnership between the Human Rights Center and the Center for Responsible Business directed by Robert Strand, I'm pleased to welcome you all to this very special joint Berkeley Haas Dean's Speaker Series and Rudolph Peterson Speaker Series. We're grateful to have this online platform to welcome you all here today, even though we can't be together in person. During these difficult and changing times, we'd like to open by recognizing the millions of workers around the world who do not have the option to postpone or cancel their work activities or shift to remote forms of working. These are drivers who take us around and deliver our packages, service workers who make meals, factory workers who are providing critical supplies, and others who can't afford to shut down. We commend all the companies out there that are thinking deeply about how their decisions and responses to the coronavirus will impact workers. Given this, our conversation this morning on leadership during times of crises is more relevant than ever. As the core partner of the Human Rights and Business Initiative, which believes that human rights must be central to every major business decision, Microsoft has helped UC Berkeley equip current and future business leaders with the attitude and the aptitude to advance business respect for human rights everywhere. Our speaker today is one of the longest serving executives at Microsoft. He's been dubbed by the New York Times as the, and I quote, de facto ambassador for the technology industry at large. He's earned that title as an outspoken advocate of the belief, and I'm quoting again, that when your technology changes the world, you bear a responsibility to help address the world you've helped to create. As Microsoft's president, Brad leads a team of more than 1,400 business, legal, and corporate affairs professionals working in 56 countries. He plays a key role in spearheading the company's work on critical issues involving the intersection of technology and society, including cybersecurity, privacy, artificial intelligence, human rights, immigration, philanthropy, and environmental sustainability. In his recently published book, Tools and Weapons, The Promise and Peril of the Digital Age, Brad draws from his experiences to reflect on how technology can serve humanity rather than be weaponized to inflict harm. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. Brad, first, thank you so much for being here today and for taking the time to speak with all of us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be with everybody.
Well, and particularly right now, I think we're really looking for leadership in times of crises. And given your longstanding role at Microsoft as one of Microsoft's longest serving executives, and as someone who's worked directly for all three of Microsoft's CEOs, including Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer, and Satya Nadella, I was wondering if we could jump off and kickstart the conversation by talking a little bit about your time at Microsoft and what that institutional longevity and knowledge bring to Microsoft's current work.
Well, I am fortunate to have worked under three, I just think, really interesting and even superlative CEOs, Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer, and Satya Nadella. And I think when you work for a place long enough, and I've been at Microsoft for more than 26 years, it gives you a perspective that comes with time, either the time you experience yourself or the time that anybody can get by reading about history and the like, which I'm a big fan of. You go through good times and bad. Inevitably, you're perhaps shaped more by the hard times than the easy ones. For me personally, went through some difficult challenges for Microsoft as we went through a set of antitrust issues in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Lived through and had to help lead through the Great Recession that started really in 2008, 2009. And so, here we are in a completely different kind of challenge, but inevitably you see certain similarities and you draw on those. And I think we've all tried to draw on those as a leadership team at Microsoft, but with an appreciation for the lessons of the past and that institutional knowledge. It's a real asset, I find.
Turning to Microsoft's response to COVID-19, can you talk a little bit about how you responded as a company and why you chose the responses that you have?
It's a fascinating question because I think the first thing you realize is that when a crisis suddenly stares you in the face, especially a crisis that really was unexpected, you have to face it with what you've got. Over time, you can build new capabilities but certainly not the first week or the first month. And I think we have a strong and a close-knit senior leadership team at the company. I think that was a huge asset for us. So the first thing we did was decide initially to have a daily call. There's 14 of us, and work through all of the key decisions together. The second thing we did, which I think has turned out to be just critical, both in Seattle but also in Northern California, was to work as a community. For me, I thought one of the most important principles was that we would listen to the advice of experts. And this is a public health issue first. And so it meant that the first thing we had to do was listen to people who, as I put it, have a PhD in public health. There are people who've literally devoted their academic and working careers to this discipline and to serving the public health. We've been really fortunate to have somebody inside Microsoft who has that job, who has that background. But what it really led us to do was connect with first the county and then the state public health authorities to work really closely with our county executive, with the mayor of Seattle, with the governor of Washington State, and make decisions very quickly based on that advice. The first thing we did, frankly, was send our employees to work from home as soon as the county health authorities advised that as a recommendation. And I think your point at the outset is really good. Look, not everybody can do that. There are some people that don't have a home. There are many people that have a home, but they don't have good connectivity or the kinds of digital technology resources that we have. But we could, and therefore it was important that we did. And then we thought very quickly, really within 24 hours of sending people home, about some of our broader responsibilities. The first step we took, really, we were the first company to take the step of saying that we were going to continue to pay the hourly workers of all of the vendors who work on our campuses and in our buildings, even if their work was not needed because the buildings were closed. So we had a common set of values that we didn't have to ask ourselves about. We had a common way of working together. We had a lot of confidence in each other and a desire to rely on expertise. So I think all of that enabled us to move faster, and so far, at least, I think make decisions that appear to be passing the test, proving to be pretty sound.
So given that, and what it sounds like you had already teed up that really facilitated this process, were there internal or external roadblocks that you came up against that you had to work around with or through in order to make this happen?
Well, every decision involves a potential roadblock because you might not have an agreement or you might not have clarity on who the decision maker is. I think we were able to overcome those quickly, principally because we knew who the decision maker was and we knew the values on which we wanted to rely. But I think part of it just unfolded in real time, and there were definitely some lessons for us in those. One was just sort of, were we going to send our employees home? We sent them home 19 days before the governor put in place a shelter-in-place order. And we did that because we had a dialogue with the county executive and his public health team. We were sharing with him the kinds of factors that would be important for us, and we felt other large employers. But I said to him personally, if you recommend that people work from home, we will immediately follow your advice. So it was that kind of shared dialogue that broke what could otherwise have been a protracted conversation or decision-making process. And similarly, the next day, when we were trying to figure out, okay, what would we do for our hourly employees? I think that there were three things we really benefited from. The first was a broad perspective from Satya Nadella, our CEO, which was to make sure we were paying special attention to the people that we employ directly or indirectly who would be the hardest hit by this. And by definition, that meant hourly employees who are more likely to be living paycheck to paycheck. The second is the kind of really sound financial and operational infrastructure that Amy Hood, our CFO, applied. So literally by the next morning after we sent people home, she had her team analyzing who was it who would be at risk this way, what would it mean for us to move forward and say, let's pay them anyway. And then the third was really the dialogue that Amy and I had, as we do about almost everything. And literally, we were on a call with the broader business community in Seattle. They were saying, gee, they were worried about their hourly employees. I think, frankly, they were sort of hoping that somebody would go first and create the air cover for others to follow. And at that point, I was still in the office. Amy was still in the office. Her office is about 30 yards from mine. And literally, somebody walked down and had her come in and join the call. And she said, we were ready to go. And I asked people on the call, well, if we go now and we announce publicly in the next 2 hours that we're going, will that help everybody else? And everybody said, yes, please. So we did. And we published a blog. And yeah, I think it's that kind of quick decision making that makes all the difference in a moment of crisis. But it really does require common values that have been developed and shared over time. And then people who feel comfortable and confident making decisions quickly.
So to follow up on that even a little bit more, I know your role has often been described as the quote unquote unofficial global ambassador for Microsoft, given how much you've worked to get politicians, working with tech companies and the public more generally on technology's role in society. Would you say that that coming together of the political, economic, and social sectors is really key to responding to a crisis like COVID-19? And if so, how would you like to see them working together, perhaps in an even more integrated fashion, if at all, in the future?
Well, first, absolutely. I mean, just think about it. For all of us, almost regardless of where we've grown up, we have probably never lived in a time where the government was making decisions that have as direct and detailed an impact on our daily lives as governments have been making around the world over the last few months. I mean, literally, can we leave our homes? Can we go to a movie? Can our kids go to school? Can we, if you're a student watching this, go to class with our fellow students? It's just extraordinary, especially for a country like, say, the United States or the countries in Western Europe, where this literally only happens in a time of war. And so by definition, we're all impacted by government decisions more. I think government decisions need to be informed by people who can say, this is what it's going to mean if you do A or B, and how can you put these together? I think the issues for the tech sector are especially important, really for multiple reasons. I mean, first, the role that we as a company in a tech sector have been playing have really been almost extraordinary. At Microsoft, we've really prioritized three things. One is serving public health with data and technology. The second is trying to sustain the operations of the economy with remote work, remote learning, remote support for nonprofits, and really thinking ahead to what an inclusive economic recovery will require. And the third is preserving trust in technology. And I think this connects especially closely with human rights. Because I think fundamentally, we need to find ways to protect the public health and protect privacy and protect the ethics, I'll say, of artificial intelligence, digital safety, protecting against cyber attacks, all the things that collectively add up to human rights. And I think across the tech sector, you've seen a number of companies scramble. I think you've seen a number of companies do really good work in this space, but the days are still early. Unfortunately, we have probably some number of years rather than months before we can get to the last chapter of the history of COVID-19. And I think these are days that really will test us, both to support the public at large and bring people together, but I also think really to stand up for the kinds of values that you have stood up for and your center has stood up for, and that students and faculty have stood up for. Especially as I think about the intersection between, say, technology and human rights.
I know one of the things at the Human Rights Center we have as our tagline is pursuing justice through science and law, and certainly deeply appreciate the empirical approach and data-driven approach that you've been bringing to this crisis. I think also at times like this where things are shifting so quickly and the data may point us in one direction one moment, but facts on the ground may change radically and quickly in another direction. How do leaders and the companies they lead maintain integrity and trust with both their employees internally and their customers or other external stakeholders in times of crisis? Do you have advice on that?
Yeah, I think it's a time when transparency serves us well. I think that's the first thing. Yeah, and I think you see this in issues around the world. It's really hard to sustain public trust if the public doesn't have confidence that it's getting all the information it needs and deserves just to understand what's going on. And I'm just personally fascinated by, I'll say, the juxtaposition of what we're seeing from, say, Governor Cuomo in New York and the lessons of the past. As you know, from having seen the book that Carol Ann Brown at Microsoft and I wrote, we really believe in drawing on the lessons from history to think about the future of technology. And so one of the things that I've done throughout this is read about the huge pandemic of 1918. And one of the things that was so clear about the handling of that pandemic is that truth was sacrificed. It was easy for government officials in the United States in 1918 to sacrifice truth because the nation was at war. And therefore, they really censored information about the nature of the influenza. Ironically, it's called in some cases the Spanish flu. But if you were to define that flu based on where it started, the only accurate label would be to call it the American flu or the Kansas flu or the Southwest Kansas flu, because it started in Kansas, spread to American soldiers who then took it with them when they went off to Europe to fight in World War I. And it first spread to France and British troops and to Germany because they were the combatants. But no one knew about that because every one of those countries was at war and they all censored information. It's only when it went across the border to Spain, which was a neutral and didn't have censorship, that newspapers started to write about it. And then it also eventually spread later, 6 months later, in every city in the world, and especially in a number of the major US cities. It swept through Philadelphia, it swept through New York. And time and again, the governors, the mayors, President Woodrow Wilson never even spoke about it. And people realized that they couldn't have any confidence in what their leaders were saying because too often they weren't giving them any news at all. If they were saying anything, it was mostly don't worry. And so when I see Governor Cuomo stand up and say, look, I'm just going to give you the facts, I'm not going to sugarcoat anything. The first thing you would say is it's either a remarkable coincidence or he's been advised by someone who read about what happened in New York State and New York City a century ago. And I think that same leadership requirement is really important for all of us who are working on projects that impact this, who are leading teams, in our case at Microsoft, 150,000 employees. First and foremost, to be forthcoming, to be transparent, to talk about what we're deciding and why, and what we know and what we don't, and to acknowledge that many days there are many things we don't yet know.
And I think that's a big piece of this is the honesty around that. People are smart, and if they have accurate data and accurate information, they can often make really good choices for themselves, their families, and their communities. So you've talked a bit about the importance of truth and transparency. There's another kind of element that you've mentioned previously that I'd love to dive into. So Haas has a set of leadership principles that really define the type of leader that UC Berkeley is really seeking to produce. And one of them is called confidence without attitude. Mm-hmm. When asked during an interview for a word to summarize your advice to emerging leaders, you chose one that I think many people found unexpected, yet very telling, and that was humility. Why humility?
Well, I just think that if you want to provide any kind of leadership in a rapidly changing world, you constantly need to be learning, you constantly need to be adapting, You constantly need to be trying new things and then assessing whether they work and then adapting based on whether they do. And you don't really learn very much if you never stop talking. You almost certainly don't learn very much if you think you already know all the answers. So I actually think that humility is almost a superpower for leaders if they focus on developing it. I actually love your phrase because you do need confidence. You can't lead if you can't make decisions, and you can't make decisions if you don't have some confidence. But I think you have to have the kind of confidence that says this is the right decision for today. We may need to revisit it as we experiment and learn. What I find at Microsoft is we have 3 leadership principles, and we've had them for a couple of years, and I've really found them to be valuable for myself, and I think for a lot of people who I get to work with. It's really clarity, ensuring that people understand what the decision is. It's energy, generating energy for people to come along and work together and work as a team. And really driving results, having accountability, having an ability to know whether your decisions are working and adapt. And what I find most interesting is to think about this as the difference between peacetime and wartime. I do think this is like wartime. It's just a war by humanity against a virus, against a war by one country against another. And I do think that the number one thing that changes in wartime is the need for speed. You cannot take as much time to generate the energy, frankly, that comes by talking things through with a little bit more time, almost the luxury of time. You don't have that when you're fighting a war. You need even more clarity about what you're going to do, clarity about the priorities that you're going to set. You need to make decisions faster about what you will do and what you will not do. You especially need more role clarity. Who is going to do this and who is going to do that? And let's make sure that each team knows what it's doing and where it needs to rely on the other. What I'm basically finding in the first couple of months of this is that the same principles that I'll say were the right principles in a time of peace are the right principles for this war against a virus, but we need to look at all 3 principles through the lens of how to make decisions faster, sustain energy, morale in a very stressful time, even if you're fortunate to be able to work from home and be of good health and a family of good health, and still be promoting accountability because it's the only way to be effective. So I think it's really interesting. This is not something that in my view says, oh, throw out what we were doing before, now do something different. It's keep the same principles, but adapt to different circumstances.
Well, and I know that a few people have pushed back against the idea of the pandemic being analogized to war, but I think one thing that is very powerful about that analogy is the idea of having a common enemy that we should be working to ultimately figure out how we advance society and continue society in very important ways, given this rapidly changing environment in which you're talking about what you're talking. Which kind of brings me to a next question. Kevin Scott, of course, Microsoft CTO, has said in a recent interview about the pandemic, and I'm quoting, "I think this moment is going to create a pressure to do things in a very different way." As we look to the next phase of this crisis, what changes do you think we might see in a post-COVID-19 world? And what changes would you like to see come out of this?
I think it's a really interesting question. And to continue some of the war analogies, people talk about the fog of war for good reason. When you're in the middle of it, there's fog and you cannot see the horizon. And, in the spirit of humility, I think the first thing I would say is we have to recognize we're in a sort of foggy time, and there are certain things we discern, and there's a lot that is going to continue to unfold that will make us smarter as things go forward. And I do think when I sort of study how people have responded to major challenges like this, crises, whether it's the Great Depression, or something like, say World War II or something of that magnitude, I tend to note 2 things in particular. One is it tends to accelerate rapidly certain trends that were already taking place. I think a great analogy is that when war started in 1939, there were still biplanes flying over Europe in the air forces of some of the combatant countries. By 1945, 6 years later, there were jet aircraft. And that probably would have taken, say, 2 decades, and that was compressed to 6 years. And what I would point to as the analogy here is, not surprisingly, perhaps, at least in part, digital technology. I think it's fair to say that we have seen 2 years of digitization progress in 2 months in terms of the adoption of digital technologies on a global basis. We see governments moving wholesale to putting more of their employees in the cloud. We see data being put to work for healthcare authorities. We see all of us spending a lot of time looking each other in the eye, but through a screen, through this kind of audio-visual technology. So there's this massive acceleration, and I think that will persist really for 2 reasons. One is, as we return to the workplace, we're not all going to return together. It's really clear that we flipped a switch to bring people home, but we'll turn a dial gradually to send people back. So I think for some period of time, maybe it's a year, maybe it's a little less, maybe it's 2 years, we're going to be living in a hybrid world and operating in a hybrid economy, so to speak. Some employees will be in the office. Some employees will be home and they need to work together. Some consumers will be comfortable going to a restaurant. Others will still want to place their order digitally and stop by or have it delivered. So I think we're going to see the need for more digital skills. I think that's one of the things that Kevin recognizes. And I see that as something that will continue to accelerate and then will persist after the crisis passes. I think that that's sort of on the maybe more positive side, at least if you're in the tech sector. I do think this is something that is bringing to the surface a lot of the inequalities in our world, the income inequalities, the internet inequalities, the educational inequalities. And I think a big question will be how people feel about that as this goes forward. I think that has been something that has been gaining political momentum in many countries, including the United States. And I think it'll be an even bigger and more important political and policy issue for the United States and other countries as we come out of this. The last thing that I would highlight is, in many cases, in a time of war, there's a sense that certain things need to be sacrificed in order for a public cause to triumph. And human rights are often at risk. And I do think right now we are seeing in some parts of the world, some governments either genuinely sacrificing human rights to some degree in order to fight this virus. I think there's a real risk that we'll see some governments use this as an excuse to dial back on the protection of human rights that they were actually seeking to dial back on in the first place. I think it's a hugely important issue for the tech sector as we see more technology potentially deployed to test and track and trace individuals and the like. So I think that this is a time where we need to find a way to defeat this virus and stand up for human rights and protect privacy. There may be days when these are in tension, but I believe that if there is smart work by people of goodwill, we can find a way to defeat this virus and protect things like privacy. And that needs to be an ongoing priority for all of us, in my view.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad to hear you underscoring the importance of that, because I think whenever we come at moments of profound shift in the ways that societies operate, it creates new vulnerabilities and new opportunities, and how we begin to minimize those vulnerabilities and create new opportunities for human rights and the effectuation of them. I think the tech sector has a critical role to play in helping bring that to the fore. With that, we've been having questions pouring in on the side during the conversation, and I think I will start with one of the ones that kind of ties nicely to what you were just focused on, and that's the issue of privacy. So Adam Leipzig has asked, picking up on what you said about COVID-19, what role can technology play in the pandemic while maintaining privacy without adverse impact? There's, of course, a lot going on in the news right now around contact tracing, the use of digital technologies to understand our networks, and ideally to help people understand if they're at risk and to make smart choices about advancing the economy. But how can we best protect privacy given these new applications of technology in society?
I actually think that it is something that is more than achievable if we put our minds to it. The first thing I would do is step back and say, look, when the history of this pandemic is written, the most important technology, in my view, will not be digital technology. It will be pharmaceutical technology, because that is what is going to lead to a new vaccine and to a therapeutic treatment. And that is ultimately the technology that will defeat this virus for humanity. And I will say digital technology and data and machine learning and lots of other things and will play key roles. But so far, I haven't seen real scenarios that put privacy rights at risk, or at least need to put privacy rights at risk in order to pursue that. The second thing I'll say is we're seeing data play what I believe is just an indispensable role in helping public health authorities manage through this crisis. But there again, I've seen the best work done in ways that really have not put privacy at risk. I've been fascinated to see, for example, in Greece, the government of Greece has been able to maintain a much lower mortality rate than, say, the United States, for the simple reason that they have a dashboard that rolls up all of the ICU beds in all of the hospitals in the country so they can manage their hospital capacity. I've seen our own data science team at work here in Washington State, all the way up to the World Health Organization on a global basis. But it's really data that never captures individual identity at all. It's about test results and how many tests are taking place and how many are positive and the like. I do think that we see technology and data playing a potentially valuable role in this context of contact tracing. I think we, in the spirit of humility, should recognize even here, digital technology is not going to be a panacea. It's simply impossible for me to imagine a future in these next few years where a public health officer doesn't have to interview someone who's tested positive, doesn't have to make calls or send emails to individuals with whom that person said I had some contact, because we just live in a world where not everybody has a smartphone. And even if they do, a smartphone is not an ankle bracelet. You might go to class, if you have the chance to go to class, and forget your phone, or maybe your battery dies. So there's no foolproof app here that is going to eliminate the hard work of really dedicated individuals. But if you think about this as sort of a belt and a suspender, I do think that these apps that people are contemplating, that they're starting to build, can provide a valuable tool, can help promote public safety, but we need to do it in a way that is consistent with privacy. I give a lot of credit for the steps that Apple and Google have taken together, because I think they've really baked privacy in from the ground up. I think they're smart to say that they're only going to make their API available to apps that are really created at the authorization of a public health agency. I think they're right to put in place a variety of privacy safeguards. At Microsoft a week ago today, we published 7 privacy principles that we think are important for any technology, including these apps. And some of these I think are very straightforward. If this data is going to be collected to protect the public health, it should only be used for protecting the public health. If this data is going to be used for as long as this crisis lasts, it should not be retained thereafter. In fact, most of the data doesn't have a useful life of, call it, a few weeks, because after that, it doesn't really matter who had contact with whom 6 months ago. So if you really apply this twin filter of how do we protect public health and protect privacy, you find immediately that you can take a number of steps without any tension. And then you have some where I do think there is potential tension. In Western Europe, in North America, this is voluntary, it's opt-in. I don't think that's likely to change. I think that is very much true to our values as societies. And that will mean that it will have less impact than if you made it mandatory. But I think it's striking the right balance myself, given all of the circumstances and really issues that are at stake here.
Well, to kind of following up on that and some of these essential issues that are at stake, one of them, of course, is education, the educational sector having been hit quite hard in terms of the ways that it operates day to day. John Monahan has written, now that the internet is even more essential to access educational and economic opportunity with shelter in place, how is Microsoft responding to ensure that lower income households aren't left behind?
Well, there are some things that we can do, but I would say this is a national and even global issue, and it needs to be treated as a national and global priority and even cause. I think it requires a real movement, and I think it's one of the movements of our time. As a company, we can make technology that we have more widely and even freely available, meaning at no cost. And we're doing that in a lot of scenarios, in schools for nonprofits and the like. But as has always been the case, it doesn't do a lot of good to have software if you don't have hardware on which to run it. And when all of this needs to be linked remotely, it doesn't do a lot of good if you don't have a Wi-Fi or broadband connection. And even if you have the device and even if you have that connection, you need to have the skills to put this to work. And I think that we're going to need more skills among more people with this ongoing digitization of the economy. So in my view, two issues are of paramount importance. First is the internet inequality that exists in the world today. This is a topic that we've been passionate about as a company. Carol Ann and I devote a chapter to it in our book. And we really use the book to take people to rural communities in America. But this is true of rural communities in many parts of the world. And it is true for some families in urban centers, including in the United States as well. Some people have broadband, some do not. And the argument that we basically make is we need to recognize that broadband is functionally the electricity of the 21st century. Especially in a rural community, if you can't bring broadband, you can't bring jobs. You cannot bring the future of education. You cannot bring telemedicine to people. And we have to close this divide. And in the US, I don't believe it's a question of money. We've been spending $8 billion a year through the federal government, but without accurate data about who has broadband and who does not, we have been spending the money poorly. Mm-hmm. And I think it's good, frankly, that people are recognizing that in this crisis, this was already a crisis in our midst. We just weren't looking at it with our eyes wide open. And I think much of the same thing can be said about the skills that people need to have a bright future. If you look at the students of America and you look at who has access to a course like computer science in high school, what you would find is that the people who take that course are more male, they're more white, they're more wealthy, and they're more urban than the people who do not. And so we have this educational or skilling divide as well. So we have programs at Microsoft that we are in many ways doubling down on in new ways, our Airband initiative for broadband connectivity. You're going to see us take new steps as a company to address the skilling divide. But no one company is ever going to solve this by itself. The tech sector as a whole will not solve this by itself. It really requires leadership by people in government, working in partnership with the nonprofit community and the tech sector. And if ever there was a moment to recognize the problem that was already staring us in the face, it has to be now.
I was part of a conversation just this morning where someone on a call mentioned that she feels like we had duct taped over here in the United States a lot of the social services that were not operating at the level they could be, and that now we're beginning to see that duct tape fail when there's been this additional pressure of a pandemic placed upon it. And so I think maybe the hopeful long-term positive view is that as that duct tape fails, we are at least sensitive enough to begin to figure out how we not only patch it, but that we create an infrastructure for the future that's more durable than the one that we had.
Absolutely. I mean, look, for once, money is not really the issue. Governments are appropriating money. Let's spend it wisely to better solve some of these problems.
And I guess that gets to two other questions that have come up, one from Luke Hedlund and one from Brian Perlman, who are kind of asking about the resources that a company like Microsoft can share with other players in the space to help develop that infrastructure. So in Brian's question, he's asking about how researchers with limited budgets can collaborate with tech companies to get access to paid tools to be able to do what researchers know how to do to establish that future. And for Luke, it's about, he mentions Microsoft recently announcing it's going to release some of its data to the public to spread out the value creation from AI, and is wondering how you'll decide what data to share and what to keep. I see those as very similar questions around resources and sharing of resources. Yeah,
no, I think they're great questions because in many ways, if you ask what resources does a tech company have? Well, of course we have money, and we are spending more of our money philanthropically and the like. But I really think that the two most valuable resources that we have, aside from the skill of our employees, is the cloud resources that we have and access to data that we have. So on the cloud side, we have taken two steps really over just the last 3 weeks to provide more cloud resources for these issues. One is through our AI for Health program, which is one of our 5 AI for Good initiatives. Each of these is really aimed at trying to make cloud resources, the use of Microsoft Azure and AI, more accessible to people. In this case, in many instances, people doing research. Because of the importance of research, especially in the health field and the scientific disciplines, and really addressing this. So just, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, we launched a new $20 million initiative to provide additional access to these kinds of resources and team up our data science and AI experts with researchers wanting to do this work. And then last week, we announced an open data campaign. And as you might imagine, we didn't invent this out of thin air, starting in the middle of March. We had started working on this last year. And we really do think that one of the critical imperatives for advances in science, and I'll say including in this field and addressing COVID-19, is better use of open data sets. And what we really need to do is create an environment where people can federate data, they can allow their data to be shared without losing their ownership rights in it, without surrendering the privacy protections in it that are needed. And so what we did last week was articulate 5 open data principles for ourselves. The most interesting in my view is really around usability, because one of the things I just keep finding in all of the projects we're doing with public health authorities around the world is until we really promote a broader understanding of what it takes to make data usable, we're just going to be holding ourselves back. And so often it really just requires more common data schema and the like in order to have data that effectively can be aggregated and shared. But we also committed ourselves as a company to pursue 20 open data initiatives in the next 2 years. And what that means is that we're really looking at all of the data that we have that is important to societal issues, like broadband coverage, like health issues, like humanitarian concerns. And we're going to open up those data sets. We announced a partnership with the Open Data Institute, ODI, in the United Kingdom. And you're going to see us take a number of concrete steps. We're definitely in the market for great ideas, where people see big problems that require the opening up of more data to which we can contribute with the data sets that we have. I do think that this has been another one of these emerging trends that is being accelerated because of this pandemic. But what it really points us to is a brighter future. Again, if I go back to one of the great lessons of World War II, the United States won the war really by bringing together the federal government and the great research universities of the country, including Berkeley. And it was a partnership that made it possible to accelerate all of the country's needs during a 4-year period. And interestingly enough, I think that, in my own opinion, was the single most important and lasting change to come to the United States out of that experience. And this notion that the federal government needs to fund basic research and that it needs to look to the 60 or 70 great research universities in the country to put researchers to work with that funding to go pursue great basic scientific advances. And in the same way, I think that this is a hallmark of our time. There's data everywhere. Literally, we're starting this decade, as we note in our book, with 20 times as much digital data as the planet had in the year 2010. But this data is not yet really being opened up. It's not usable in a greater way and for greater impact. And so it's like having this underutilized asset. And now we can and should take steps to make the most of it. We need it for this issue, but we actually need it for everything we want to accomplish in the future.
Great. Well, we have so many really important questions that have come up. And of course, though our time is relatively limited, I can't imagine a better way to begin to close than to look at the past to better understand our present and what we can be doing now to make a stronger future. So with that, do you have any last comment or thought that you'd want to share with everyone?
Well, let me just in close. First, thank you for spending the time. Thank you for doing what you're doing. I mean, look, this is not an easy time for anybody. And I just remember so clearly what it meant to be in a college or a university, to be an undergraduate or a graduate student. And, perhaps find that you'd started in 2007 in a great, economy, and suddenly it was 2009 and you were graduating into a recession. And I just think in that spirit of facing the future with our eyes wide open, we should all acknowledge this is a more difficult time than any of us imagined than when we celebrated New Year's Eve, just less than 5 months ago. But what I would also say is everything that you've been focused on is actually extremely important for the work that needs to be done in the months ahead, and even more importantly, in the decade ahead. I do think that digital technology and data are going to shape the next decade, perhaps even more so than the last, and that is saying a lot. I think that the great challenges that we were focused on when this year began are going to remain the great challenges when this decade comes to an end. I think it's a pretty safe bet that in the year 2030, we'll be talking less about COVID-19, but probably even more about climate change, about water and waste and biodiversity. All of these issues around finding the cure for cancer, closing these divides that are so important in our societies will remain. Human rights, in my view, reflect among the most timeless values of humanity. So for all of you who have been focused on it, keep the faith. This will not be the easiest time of your life. I think if we're fortunate, all of us who are alive today will look back and say, 2020 was one of the hardest years of our lives. That's if we're fortunate, because it means that there's not something even worse lying ahead. But I think if you stay committed, if you are persistent, if you're perhaps a little more patient than you might have thought you needed to be when this year began, the future always needs great people. That to me was one of the lessons of having to be a leader at Microsoft in 2009. It also needs great people committed to timeless values. That to me was one of the lessons of leading a tech company in the wake of 9/11, as we describe in our book. So your future remains as bright as it was even if it may take a little longer in some cases to realize all of the ambitions we had for what we wanted to accomplish this year. We're still going to be looking for great people. Even in a recession, you can never find enough great people. So I look forward to seeing what you can do. Thank you for spending the time with me.
Thank you. On behalf of Berkeley Haas's Dean, Ann Harrison, and the Human Rights and Business Initiative at the Human Rights Center and Center for Responsible Business, I want to give a huge thanks to Brad Smith for joining us during this crucial moment for safeguarding and advancing human rights globally. We're really grateful for your continued leadership and your partnership in our work, so thank you. And I think one thing I've definitely taken from this conversation is just how much we are all in this together and have this opportunity to create the new world we want to see. Thank you.
Great, thank you.